Good morning and welcome to Energy Shots. This morning we begin with a reflection of the life of former Vice President Dick Cheney. Kevin, welcome again to CSIS.
Thanks, Joseph. It's great to do this every couple of weeks with you. Former Vice President Dick Cheney passed away this week. He'll be remembered for many things. One of them was that he led the National Energy Policy Development Group during the first months of the first term of former President George W. Bush, which delivered its recommendations in May of 2001, many of which shaped the Energy Policy Act of 2005. You may recall that one of those provisions, which was written about this week, was Section 322 of the Energy Policy Act of 2005. Mike Sorahan at E&E News wrote an article about that provision, which modified Section 1421D, if anyone's keeping score at home, of the Safe Drinking Water Act to exclude injection of fluids and propping agents other than diesel fuel for the fracturing of oil, gas, and geothermal wells. That's been referred to, there's a November 2nd, 2009 New York Times article at the height of the fracking debate that referred to the Halliburton loophole. You're familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
So there are perspectives, competing perspectives on that. Some perspectives include that maybe it wasn't just Dick Cheney who was pushing for that.
Right.
Another perspective on that is that it wasn't just Halliburton. There were other companies that were seeking that, pursuing it. And then maybe the one that I think gets underappreciated with the space of 20 years is that it wasn't necessarily a loophole. If you talk to the staff of former Senator Jeff Bingaman, who had endorsed actually keeping the status quo on underground injection under the Safe Drinking Water Act in place, and asked what they were doing, I think a lot of them were looking at it as a way to preserve the status quo. There had been a 1997 federal court ruling on coal bed methane fracking in Alabama that led to state regulation. The idea was, well, let's not change the regulatory policy as we're studying this. Let's look forward with the things the way they are. That's how some people look back on that and say it. But there are, of course, critics who have different perspectives.
Well, and of course, I mean, it's named that way because the former vice president had also been, I believe, the CEO of Halliburton, right?
Yes.
And Halliburton benefited greatly from maintaining that policy. But I think it's a key element of the linkages between small policy changes that we talk about day to day and the grand scheme, the big narratives of U.S. geopolitical power, economic development. So Dick Cheney being at the head of that council, now 25 years later, we've had the fracking revolution, and that's resulted in incredible changes in where the U.S. sources our energy and the role of shale development and hydraulic fracturing in our energy security and economy.
Maybe we should look at the next slide then.
I think so.
So, I mean, there are a lot of folks who would say that maybe this overstates the case on Section 322, but there's no overstating what's in this slide here. I think a lot of people are familiar with some version of this. This is trailing 12-month gas production from the Shale region from January of 2010 through the latest month of robust EIA data in July, and it shows a more than 600% increase from essentially 11 BCF a day to 85 BCF a day. This enabled a lot of things, one of which I think on the next slide we can probably talk about because it seems timely given other events in the world. And one of those things is so this is a starting from base 100, again, January of 2010, we're looking at trailing 12-month on a thermal basis, gas going into the power sector, this green line at the top, up 90% through the latest month of data. We look at coal, again, on an energy content basis, this blue line going into the power sector, down nearly 60% over that same interval. The generation of power up, roughly 11%, but the greenhouse gas emissions from that power through, again, the latest month, down 32%, which is, I think, a pretty significant story. And I mean, you've put some raw numbers to it.
I mean, this is exactly the benefit that Shale revolution brought about when you come to think about U.S. carbon intensity and greenhouse gas emissions. In 2010, the U.S. power sector was emitting almost 2,300 million metric tons of CO2 annually. And in 2023, which is the last data available from the EPA, but we don't actually anticipate much change between 2023 and 2025, we were down to roughly 1,500. This is on mass in mass terms, just in million metric tons of CO2, one of the largest reductions in CO2 emissions we've seen in the developed economy, and it was driven by this underlying economic story, the availability of gas, the closure of coal. Of course, the addition of renewables is going to continue to help us draw this down, but even outside the geopolitics, there's a positive climate benefit to the former vice president's career that's probably often overlooked by his detractors.
There are ironies in energy policy. I don't think, for example, Barack Obama expected to be the president of Shale.
Yeah.
And it turned out that in his first term, President Donald Trump was the greenest president ever. He presided over a boom in renewables, which, as you say, was a contributing component to this. But if we go to the next slide, there are flows, as you would say, Dr. Majkut, and there are stocks.
Well, and before we get to this, I think we do have to recognize there's some other things happening this week. One of them is the beginning of the COP30 conference in Brazil, where world leaders, excepting the United States and a couple others, will discuss global progress on climate change.
Interesting that you say that. The story you just described of coal to gas fuel switching, along with, of course, renewables going into the mix, is a good news story, the kind of thing that you'd want to tell at the 30th Conference of Parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Yes.
There's really not going to be anyone there to tell it in Belém.
Right.
But if you look at the
What
story...
are we looking at?
Well, the story here is not the story of U.S. power generation emissions reductions. It is the story of atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide as measured by the national NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Sorry, it's too many acronyms and abbreviations to remember.
Yes.
UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, May 1994. We go forward. We're up about 20% in the concentration measured there over the interval through the signing of the One Big Beautiful Bill Act in July of this year. And so youth activist Greta Thunberg has been very vocal in her criticism, probably, I think, maybe a little unfair about this process, has called it blah, blah, blah.
Right.
But there is a perspective that if you look at what's going on here, the stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has continued to increase despite this process. So,
and Kevin, just out of curiosity, when was the first time that you thought about the parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere as it relates to climate change? Do you remember the rough date?
I remember seeing numbers in the 2000s and thinking about it. And of course, once there was an organization called 350.org, I started to think about it a lot more closely.
Yeah, and for myself, it must be probably about the end of my college career. I would say 2005, 2006, maybe 2007. Which is interesting because so much politics had already occurred that we're still living with today. The Kyoto Protocol was adopted in 1998, if I've got it right. Of course, the same Energy Council that the Vice President led made the recommendation that the U.S. withdraw from the Kyoto Protocol, even though we hadn't ratified it in the Senate. Couldn't get over that 66-vote hurdle.
The Byrd-Hagel
resolution. And then for all of the work that we've done on public policy, for all the changes we've seen, as you said, the stock problem of CO2 in the atmosphere, as we continue to see emissions rise, accumulates, causing global warming, and we will do our best to try and figure out what to do from here.
Well, yeah, and the slope is not appreciably flattening if you look at the stock again, even despite bends in the curve as far as flows go. But maybe we can look at the next slide, because one of the questions about how countries address this in their policy process is whether they make sort of temporary changes that can swing with the political pendulum as regulations change from administration to administration, or whether they are in a position to actually change underlying laws. And one of the institutional barriers to changing laws is the legislative filibuster in the U.S. Senate, which I believe we have a chart on. Although
it's coming.
Here it is. So a little bit about this chart. So again, we like to look at data sources that can simplify our understanding of very complex issues. There's a group called voteview.com that computes member ideology scores. +1 is maximally conservative, -1 is maximally progressive. And so if you look on the y-axis, what you've got here is what they call their Dimension 1 DW Nominate score. The red bubbles show the members of the GOP conference in the Senate over their tenure from sort of oldest, 45 years at the outside, to 0. And the blue, of course, are the Democratic Party's caucus, including the independents who caucus with them. And there's two things that I think are apparent about the chart. One of which is that you can see that if you look at the trend line Republicans are trending more conservative
Yep.
over time. So you actually, over the years since 2013, when the filibuster underwent fairly significant reform, the late former Majority Leader Harry Reid changed the interpretation of the filibuster rule so that you only needed a simple majority to be able to approve nominees at lower levels within the government.
Yep.
And that so-called nuclear option was invoked at that time. 33 of the 53 Republicans in this data set have joined the Senate in the years following 2013.
Yes.
They are slightly more conservative, like a 0.59 compared to the sort of the 0.56 overall average. But if you look at the last 5 years of tenure, 17 of those 17 of those 53, the same pool, are about half a standard deviation more conservative. So what I'm getting at here is that right now there are not obviously 51 senators who are willing to do this. President Trump, though, started the week asking for this, not necessarily for energy policy or climate policy reasons, but he was pressuring his Senate conference, the Republican conference, to make a very big change. His logic was, if you don't do this, you're not going to be able to deliver for the American people. Republicans will suffer politically. And by the way, the Democrats will do it anyway.
And the argument here was eliminate the filibuster as a condition for funding bills for the government or broader legislative change.
Well, perhaps both. It doesn't have to be both, right? It could be a very tailored change like some of the changes we've seen, or it could be a broader one. But I think it tends to be a one-directional move. Once institutional bulwarks fall, you don't rebuild them.
Of course. And let's think a little bit about what the implication of this chart is, Kevin, for a world that had a U.S. that had a more parliamentary style legislature. You've got a relatively more conservative Republican bloc that has a very durable majority, if you sort of look at the maps of where red states are. And what do you think would be the change to energy policy if we were to eliminate the filibuster?
Well, it could facilitate some of the difficult issues that have never gotten to 60, right? And that includes climate policy. It also includes permitting reform.
I spent a little time after the president made this argument for our show today, thinking about where has the filibuster actually stood in the way of energy policy over the last 15 years. Of course, one of the headline examples is the cap and trade debate in 2009 and 2010. While that never actually got to a vote in the Senate, the Waxman-Markey bill coming over from the House as an example, or any of the alternatives, some of them even bipartisan pieces of legislation, nothing was ever brought to a vote out of fear that it wouldn't be able to clear the parliamentary process in the Senate, which is you have to vote in the cloture.
Yes.
And fearing the embarrassment of that failure, I think they never brought anything to the floor. But it's obvious that at that time there was enough of a Democratic majority that if you had majority-only rules for Senate voting, you probably would have seen comprehensive climate legislation in the United States.
Yes, and I recall at the time you mentioned that it was bipartisan. Some bills were, they became less bipartisan. You started to see the fragmentation of bipartisanship. The Kerry Graham-Lieberman bill became the Kerry-Lieberman bill, for example, as Graham stepped out, even though he's been a moderate on climate issues.
Well, and Kevin, over the last 10, 15 years, there have been a few other places where environment and energy or climate and energy bills actually have gotten a cloture vote that has failed. And I think it's interesting to think about just, what would a world have looked like if the cloture hadn't stopped it, right? So in 2012, there was a bill from Senator Menendez to repeal oil and gas tax treatments for drilling and depreciation rules. That failed to clear a cloture vote. In 2014, there was the Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Bill. This was Senators Portman and Shaheen had a bipartisan bill for energy efficiency measures. That also failed to clear the cloture line. Famously, also in 2014, we had a series of votes on approving Keystone XL.
Not at all a controversial issue.
No, not at all. That one narrowly missed the vote, 659 to 41. I remember, and I know you were watching it closely at the time as well.
Yes.
That was a big debate, and we weren't sure which way that vote was going to go in the end. And then in March 2020, the American Innovation Act mentioned in Murkowski, the first version hit a cloture vote in 47-44. Later, that bill passed under some revisions regarding HFC phase downs and a variety of other issues.
Can you show us a scorecard for the people at home?
Yeah,
so
Kevin, I mean, this is actually where it's kind of gets interesting. As nerds of the Senate and the American parliamentary process, there is an argument that the filibuster is there not just to block things, but to improve things. And so if you look at across all those different bills, where has language eventually gotten into law? Where did the process of the greatest deliberative body in the world actually work? I think you can look at both the Energy Savings and Industrial Competitiveness Act, which later language from that bill did make it into into the statute, as well as the 2020 American Innovation Act. Eventually, after some changes, it passed later that year. While cap and trade, tax treatment for oil drilling, and the Keystone XL approvals have never gotten a strong vote in the Senate.
Well, so this is one of those cases where I think that newer blood with different institutional priorities, different institutional memory can bring about some change. But it wasn't that long ago that the Democrats very nearly made the change anyway. In the Biden administration, had it not been for former Energy Committee Chairman Joe Manchin and former Senator Kyrsten Sinema, who refused to make a change to the filibuster for a non-energy purpose during the Biden administration, it could have been rescinded as recently as the last presidential term. And I think the question is whether that movement towards a more majoritarian Senate is still pending, still looming above us. And we've seen a number of nibbles away at the filibuster and an institutional process in the Senate. There's an impatience between a technology-accelerated populace and a slow, linear, and hierarchical government process. I think American people are a little impatient. And there's also, I think, to some degree, there's an impatience coming from other quarters, other ends of Pennsylvania Avenue.
The White House as an example.
For example. But you might start to wonder at, the four horsemen of institutional drift. No vote without a filibuster, no budget without a shutdown, no election without a recount, no presidency without an impeachment. At some point, I think these sort of barriers to moving ahead are producing blowback. And to the extent that there's impatience that comes from the American people, it could be driven by that.
Yes. I mean, I agree with you. We don't speculate, we don't bet, but if you look at the trends over the last decade and a half, at the same time we had this energy revolution, the political system of the United States is straining to meet the demands of both the population and a new generation of leaders. So it'll be interesting to watch it together with you, Kevin.
We will look forward to it, both of us.
Colleagues, thank you for joining us on Energy Shots today. Kevin and I wish former President Cheney's family our sincerest condolences. May his memory be a blessing. Hope you have an energetic day, and we'll see you in a couple weeks.